In the dimly lit corridors of an ancient starship, a human guard named Elias stumbled forward, his breath ragged and uneven. The metallic walls around him seemed to pulse with life, their surfaces etched with alien symbols that glowed faintly in hues of violet and green. His boots echoed against the cold floor as he clutched at his side where pain radiated like fire. He had been running for what felt like hours, though time itself seemed distorted aboard this vessel, a place where seconds stretched into minutes and minutes blurred into eternity. Elias wasn't supposed to be here. None of them were. A routine patrol mission on the outskirts of Earth's solar system had turned into chaos when their small fleet encountered something they could never have anticipated, a derelict alien craft drifting silently through space. It was enormous, its jagged silhouette resembling some monstrous predator poised to strike. Against all protocol, and perhaps out of sheer curiosity or hubris, they boarded it. What they found inside defied comprehension. Strange technology hummed softly in every chamber, devices pulsating with energy that no human scientist could explain. But it was the throne room deep within the ship's core that changed everything. The alien queen sat there, regal and terrifying, her form both beautiful and grotesque. Her elongated limbs shimmered under the ambient light, scales shifting colors like oil on water. Her eyes, large, multifaceted orbs, seemed capable of peering straight into one's soul. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. Her presence alone commanded silence, obedience, fear. When the first wave of humans entered her domain, she reacted not with words but with action. A flick of her wrist sent invisible forces rippling through the air, knocking soldiers off their feet like ragdolls. And then came the whip, a weapon unlike anything Elias had ever seen. It crackled with energy, each lash leaving trails of searing agony across flesh. Now Elias was alone, or so he thought. The rest of his team lay scattered throughout the labyrinthine halls, unconscious or worse. He couldn't remember how many times the whip had struck him, only that each blow carried more than physical torment. It bore humiliation, despair, and a crushing sense of insignificance. Yet still, he ran. Not because he believed escape was possible, but because surrendering meant giving up whatever shred of humanity remained. As he rounded another corner, his legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed onto the ground. Blood trickled from cuts on his arms and face, mixing with sweat that stung his wounds. He tried to rise, but his body refused to obey. Instead, he leaned back against the wall, chest heaving, vision swimming. Through the haze, he noticed something odd about the corridor ahead. Unlike the sterile uniformity of the rest of the ship, this section appeared different. The walls shimmered less harshly, almost invitingly, and faint whispers seemed to emanate from them. They weren't voices exactly, but impressions, thoughts brushing against his mind like ghostly fingers. Summoning the last reserves of strength, Elias dragged himself toward the source of the sound. Each movement sent fresh waves of pain coursing through him, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on. As he reached the end of the passage, he discovered a doorway framed by intricate carvings that pulsed gently, as if alive. Beyond it lay a chamber bathed in soft golden light, unlike any other part of the ship. At its center stood a pedestal, atop which rested an object glowing faintly, casting dancing shadows across the walls. It was a crystal translucent yet filled with swirling patterns that shifted constantly, like galaxies colliding and reforming. Something about it called to him, not just visually but emotionally. He felt drawn to it, compelled to touch it despite knowing better. With trembling hands, he reached out, fingertips brushing the surface. Instantly, images flooded his mind, visions of worlds he'd never seen, civilizations rising and falling, beings of unimaginable beauty and terror. Among these flashes, however, one image stood out sharply. The alien queen herself, but younger, softer somehow. There was sadness in her eyes, a longing that mirrored his own desperation. Before he could process what he'd witnessed, a deafening roar shattered the moment. Turning slowly, Elias saw her standing there, the queen. Her expression was unreadable, though her posture suggested fury. The whip materialized in her hand once again, crackling ominously. For a brief second, Elias considered fighting back, futile though it would be. But instead, he simply held up the crystal, offering it to her without speaking. Her gaze darted between him and the artifact, confusion flickering across her features. Then, unexpectedly, she stepped closer, her movements hesitant now rather than predatory. When she finally took the crystal from his grasp, her touch was surprisingly gentle. As soon as it left his hand, the vision ceased, leaving behind only emptiness and exhaustion. But the queen, she reacted differently. Her entire demeanor shifted, shoulders slumping slightly as if burdened by unseen weight. She stared at the crystal intently, her breathing becoming labored, almost pained. And then, to Elias's astonishment, tears began streaming down her cheeks. Large, glistening droplets fell silently to the floor, sizzling upon contact before vanishing entirely. Whatever memories or emotions the crystal evoked, they overwhelmed her completely. For the first time since encountering her kind, Elias saw vulnerability in the alien queen. Gone was the imposing figure who wielded power effortlessly. In her place stood someone haunted, broken even. She sank to her knees, cradling the crystal close to her chest. Her voice emerged then, not as commands barked telepathically, but as actual sounds, melodic yet strained. Though Elias couldn't understand the language, the raw emotion behind each syllable transcended barriers. Pain, loss, regret, all poured forth unchecked, filling the chamber with an intensity that made his own suffering pale in comparison. For several long moments, neither moved nor spoke. The atmosphere shifted dramatically, charged with unspoken questions and fragile understanding. Finally, the queen looked up, meeting Elias's gaze directly. In her eyes, he saw not hatred or disdain, but recognition. Recognition of shared pain, perhaps, or maybe something deeper still. Whatever secrets the crystal held, they bound them together now, two beings from vastly different worlds united by grief. But the story did not end there. No answers came immediately, no resolution presented itself neatly wrapped. Instead, uncertainty loomed large, pressing down on both of them equally. Outside the chamber, the vastness of the alien ship waited, silent witness to whatever choices might follow next. Would the queen seek vengeance for past transgressions? Or would she extend mercy born of newfound empathy? And Elias, what role would he play moving forward? Survivor, messenger, pawn. The chamber remained eerily silent except for the soft hum of energy emanating from the crystal still clutched in the alien queen's trembling hands. Her tears had slowed but not ceased, each droplet carrying with it centuries of buried sorrow. Elias watched her warily, unsure whether this sudden vulnerability signaled a shift in their dynamic or merely masked another layer of danger. His body ached, every nerve screaming for rest, yet he forced himself to stay alert. Survival depended on reading her next move correctly. After what felt like an eternity, the queen finally stirred. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate and measured, as though testing the weight of her own emotions alongside the artifact she held. The whip that had moments ago crackled with menace now lay dormant at her side, forgotten. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost hesitant, an alien melody laced with pain and curiosity. "You," she began, pausing as if struggling to find the right words. Though her language remained incomprehensible, her tone conveyed meaning beyond mere syllables. It was accusation tempered by wonder, anger softened by revelation. "You carry echoes." Elias blinked, startled. He didn't understand her words, but somehow they resonated within him. Echoes? Was she referring to the visions he'd experienced when touching the crystal? Or something deeper, something intrinsic to his very being? Before he could respond, even silently, she stepped closer, her multifaceted eyes boring into his soul. For the first time, he noticed how ancient they seemed, filled with lifetimes of wisdom and loss. She extended one clawed hand toward him, stopping just short of contact. Her gaze flickered between his face and the faint scars marring his skin, marks left not only by her whip but also by years of hardship endured long before stepping foot aboard her ship. To her, these imperfections must have told a story, one she recognized all too well. Without warning, she pressed the crystal against his chest. A surge of warmth spread through him, followed by a cascade of images more vivid than before. This time, however, they weren't fragmented glimpses of distant worlds or civilizations. They were memories, her memories. He saw herself as a young queen ascending to power amidst chaos, her people fractured by war and betrayal. He witnessed her triumphs, forging alliances, reclaiming lost territories, uniting scattered tribes under a single banner. But he also saw her failures, The sacrifices demanded of her, the loved ones lost along the way, the isolation that came with leadership. And then there was him. A figure who appeared repeatedly throughout her recollections, a male counterpart whose presence brought light to her darkest days. Together, they ruled, fought, dreamed. Until the day he vanished, leaving behind only silence and unanswered questions. That loss haunted her still, etched into every decision she made, every lash of her whip. It explained so much about her ferocity, her unwillingness to show weakness until now. When the flood of memories subsided, Elias staggered backward, overwhelmed. His knees buckled once more, and he fell to the floor, gasping for air. The Queen loomed over him, her expression unreadable yet oddly compassionate. She knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, a gesture so unexpected it sent shivers down his spine. "You see," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "You feel." He nodded weakly, unable to articulate anything coherent. How could he explain that he understood her pain because it mirrored his own? That losing his family during Earth's resource wars had hollowed him out in ways no physical wound ever could? That surviving meant carrying fragments of those you loved, letting them guide you even when hope seemed futile? For a moment, neither moved nor spoke. The connection forged between them transcended species, culture, and language. They were simply two broken souls sharing a burden too heavy to bear alone. But reality soon intruded. From somewhere deep within the ship, a low rumble reverberated through the walls, growing louder with each passing second. Lights flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows across the chamber. The Queen stiffened, her earlier vulnerability vanishing beneath a mask of authority. She stood abruptly, clutching the crystal tightly as she scanned their surroundings with sharp, calculating eyes. "What is that?" Elias managed to croak, pushing himself upright despite his protesting muscles. Her response was immediate and urgent. "Intruders." The word translated seamlessly into his mind, laden with tension. "They come for this." She gestured toward the crystal, its glow intensifying as if reacting to the disturbance. Elias's heart sank. Intruders? Who else could be aboard this derelict vessel? Surely not survivors from his team. They were either incapacitated or dead. Then who? Another faction of humans? Or perhaps another alien race entirely? Before he could dwell on the implications, the Queen grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet with surprising strength. "Come," she commanded, her tone brooking no argument. "We must move quickly." Reluctantly, Elias obeyed, allowing her to lead him out of the chamber and back into the labyrinthine corridors. Every step reignited the agony coursing through his battered body, but adrenaline dulled the worst of it. Behind them, the rumbling grew louder, accompanied now by distant shouts and metallic clangs. Whoever, or whatever, was approaching, they were close. As they navigated the twisting passages, Elias couldn't help but notice subtle changes in the Queen's demeanor. Gone was the detached ruler who had initially greeted them with hostility. In her place stood someone driven by desperation, protectiveness even. Whatever secrets the crystal contained, they clearly mattered deeply to her, and by extension, to whoever pursued them. "Why are they after it?" Elias asked, his voice barely audible over the growing cacophony. The Queen glanced at him briefly, her expression grim. "Power," she replied simply. "Knowledge. Destruction. All things coveted by those who seek dominion." Her answer chilled him. If the intruders sought the crystal for such purposes, then handing it over would unleash untold devastation. Yet keeping it meant risking capture, or worse. Either way, their situation was dire. They reached a junction where 3 corridors branched off in different directions. The Queen hesitated, her grip tightening on both the crystal and Elias's arm. After a moment's deliberation, she chose the middle path, leading them deeper into the ship's core. The air grew colder here, tinged with an acrid smell that made Elias's nose burn. Strange symbols carved into the walls pulsed erratically, as if responding to the impending threat. Suddenly, a deafening explosion rocked the corridor ahead, sending shards of debris flying in all directions. Elias ducked instinctively, shielding his face as dust and smoke filled the air. Through the haze, he glimpsed figures emerging, tall, armored beings wielding weapons unlike anything he'd seen before. Their forms were humanoid yet distinctly alien, their faces obscured by sleek helmets adorned with glowing insignias. The queen reacted instantly, raising her free hand to summon a shimmering barrier of energy between them and the newcomers. The barrier crackled violently as bolts of plasma struck it, forcing her to concentrate fully to maintain its integrity. Meanwhile, Elias scrambled backward, searching frantically for any means of escape. There was none. "Stay behind me!" the queen barked, her voice strained but resolute. Despite her earlier display of emotion, she was once again the formidable leader he'd first encountered. Only this time, she wasn't fighting solely for dominance. She was fighting for survival. For trust. For redemption. One of the armored figures stepped forward, lowering their weapon momentarily. Through the distorted visor of their helmet, Elias caught a glimpse of glowing red eyes, eyes that exuded malice and determination. The figure addressed the queen in a guttural tongue, their words harsh and clipped. Though Elias couldn't understand them, their intent was clear: surrender the crystal or perish. To his astonishment, the queen laughed, a bitter, defiant sound that echoed through the corridor. "Never," she spat, her voice dripping with contempt. With a swift motion, she hurled a burst of energy toward the group, dispersing them momentarily. Seizing the opportunity, she turned to Elias, thrusting the crystal into his hands. "Take it," she ordered, her expression fierce. "Run. Find sanctuary. Protect it." Elias stared at her, incredulous. "What about you?" "I will hold them off," she replied without hesitation. "This is my duty, as your queen, and as," she trailed off, her voice faltering for the briefest moment, "as someone who has wronged you." Her admission hit him like a punch to the gut. Wronged him? Yes, she had inflicted unimaginable pain upon him and his comrades. But hadn't she also shown him compassion, shared her deepest vulnerabilities? Hadn't they formed a bond stronger than hatred or revenge? Before he could argue further, the armored figures regrouped, advancing with renewed vigor. The queen turned to face them, her whip materializing once more in a blaze of light. As she prepared to engage them, she glanced back at Elias one final time, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Go," she urged softly. "Live." And with that, she charged forward, unleashing a torrent of energy that illuminated the corridor in blinding hues. Elias hesitated, torn between loyalty and self-preservation. But deep down, he knew what he had to do. Clutching the crystal tightly, he turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows just as the battle erupted behind him. What awaited him beyond those darkened halls, he did not know. But one thing was certain: the journey ahead would test him in ways he could never have imagined. Elias sprinted through the twisting corridors, his breath ragged and uneven as he clutched the crystal tightly to his chest. The artifact pulsed faintly in his grip, its energy resonating with his heartbeat, as though it were alive and aware of the chaos unfolding around them. Behind him, the sounds of battle grew louder. Explosions, shouts, and the crackling discharge of energy weapons reverberated through the ship's metallic veins. Each step felt heavier than the last, not just from exhaustion but from the weight of what he carried. This wasn't just a relic, it was a burden, a responsibility thrust upon him by someone who had once been his captor, and now, perhaps, something more. The corridor ahead split into two paths, both dimly lit and forbidding. He hesitated for only a second before choosing the narrower passage on the left, instinctively drawn to its shadowy concealment. His mind raced with questions. Who were those armored figures? What did they want with the crystal? And why had the queen entrusted him, a mere human guard, with its protection? As he ran, fragments of her memories continued to surface unbidden in his mind, like echoes rippling across time. He saw flashes of her younger self standing beside the male figure she loved so deeply, their unity radiating strength and hope. Then came darker visions: betrayal, loss, the slow erosion of trust among her people. Her pain became his own, intertwining with the grief he'd buried long ago when Earth fell victim to greed and war. For all their differences, they shared this bond, an understanding forged in suffering. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled violently, nearly knocking him off his feet. A deafening boom echoed through the ship, followed by an eerie silence that settled over everything like a shroud. Elias froze, heart pounding. Had the queen succeeded? Or had she fallen? Before he could dwell on the answer, a low hum began to build in the air, growing louder with each passing moment. It wasn't the sound of combat, it was something else entirely, mechanical yet organic, as if the ship itself were awakening. The walls around him shimmered faintly, the alien symbols etched into their surfaces glowing brighter than ever before. The hum escalated into a high-pitched whine, making his ears ache and his teeth grind together. Then, without warning, the floor beneath him gave way. Elias plummeted downward, the world spinning wildly as gravity seemed to warp and twist. He landed hard on a cold metallic surface several meters below, the impact jarring every bone in his body. Pain exploded through his side, and for a moment, black spots danced across his vision. Gasping for air, he forced himself to sit up, clutching the crystal protectively even as his ribs screamed in protest. He found himself in a vast chamber unlike any other part of the ship. The ceiling stretched impossibly high above him, disappearing into darkness, while the walls curved inward to form a dome-like structure. At the center of the room stood a massive device, a towering construct of interlocking rings and glowing conduits that pulsed rhythmically, like a living heart. Energy crackled along its surface, casting flickering shadows across the chamber. But what truly caught Elias's attention were the figures gathered around the device. There were at least a dozen of them, clad in the same sleek armor as the ones who had attacked the Queen. Their weapons were trained on him now, red eyes gleaming behind their visors. Yet despite their menacing presence, it was the figure standing at the forefront who commanded his full attention. Taller than the others, this individual wore no helmet, revealing a face that was unmistakably alien yet hauntingly familiar. Its features bore similarities to the Queen's, elongated limbs, iridescent scales, but there was something cruel about its expression, a sharpness in its gaze that spoke of calculation rather than compassion. When it spoke, its voice was cold and clipped, devoid of emotion. "So," it said, addressing Elias directly in flawless English, "you are the one carrying the catalyst." Elias blinked, startled. What? "The catalyst," the figure repeated, gesturing toward the crystal in his hands. "A fragment of our ancient legacy, stolen by your kind centuries ago. We have searched long and far for its return." Confusion swirled within Elias. Centuries ago? Humans hadn't even ventured beyond their solar system until recently. How could they possibly be responsible for stealing anything from these beings? Before he could voice his doubts, another memory surfaced, a fleeting glimpse from the Queen's past. She had been there, standing amidst ruins, holding the crystal aloft as flames consumed the horizon. But the faces surrounding her weren't human, they were alien, their expressions twisted with rage and despair. "You're lying," Elias shot back, his voice trembling with anger and disbelief. "This belongs to her, to the Queen." The figure tilted its head slightly, studying him with detached curiosity. "Ah, yes. Our dear sister. Still clinging to the remnants of her fractured reign, I see. Tell me, how does she fare against my forces? Does she still believe herself capable of resisting destiny?" "Sister?" Elias's stomach churned. These invaders weren't just enemies, they were family. Whatever feud existed between them ran deeper than simple conquest. It was personal, rooted in bloodlines and betrayal. And somehow, he had become entangled in their conflict. "She'll stop you," Elias growled, clutching the crystal tighter. "She won't let you take this." The figure chuckled darkly, stepping closer. "Brave words for a creature so fragile. You misunderstand, human. This is not about taking, it is about reclaiming. The catalyst holds the key to restoring balance to our fractured empire. Without it, we are doomed to decay. With it," it paused, its gaze drifting toward the pulsating device at the center of the chamber, "we ascend." Elias's blood ran cold. Ascension. Power. Destruction. The Queen's earlier warnings echoed in his mind. If these beings succeeded in using the crystal, countless lives would be lost. Not just human but alien as well. Entire civilizations would crumble under their ambition. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "I won't let you." The figure smirked, raising a hand lazily. Instantly, two of its subordinates moved forward, weapons trained on Elias. "You misunderstand again," it said calmly. Your compliance is irrelevant. Hand over the catalyst, or watch as we pry it from your corpse. Time seemed to slow as Elias weighed his options. Fight or flight. Neither seemed viable. Outnumbered and outgunned, resistance would end in death. Yet surrender meant betraying the Queen, handing over the very thing she had sacrificed everything to protect. His mind raced, searching for a third path, some way to turn the tide. And then, inspiration struck. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Elias hurled the crystal toward the central device. It soared through the air, catching the light as it spun end over end. For a split second, everyone froze, stunned by the audacity of his actions. Then chaos erupted. The crystal struck the device with a resounding clang, embedding itself within the intricate lattice of conduits. Immediately, the entire structure began to hum with increased intensity, its glow shifting from steady pulses to erratic bursts of blinding light. Sparks flew, and the air grew thick with static electricity. Alarms blared throughout the chamber, echoing off the walls like a banshee's wail. "What have you done?" the leader roared, lunging forward in a futile attempt to retrieve the crystal. But it was too late. The device was already destabilizing, its energy spiraling out of control. Elias stumbled backward, shielding his face as waves of heat washed over him. The invaders scrambled to contain the situation, shouting orders in their guttural tongue. But their efforts were useless. The catalyst had awakened something ancient and uncontrollable, a force that refused to be harnessed. Amidst the pandemonium, Elias spotted an opening. While the invaders were distracted, he darted toward a narrow passageway leading out of the chamber. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but he pushed through the pain, driven by sheer willpower. As he disappeared into the shadows, the chamber behind him erupted in a cascade of light and sound, shaking the entire ship to its core. He didn't stop running until he reached a secluded alcove hidden deep within the vessel's labyrinthine halls. Collapsing against the wall, he gasped for air, his chest heaving as sweat dripped down his brow. The distant rumble of destruction continued to echo through the ship, a reminder of the chaos he had unleashed. But as the adrenaline faded, doubt crept in. What had he truly accomplished? Had he saved the crystal, or doomed them all? And where was the Queen? Was she still alive, fighting against impossible odds? Or had she fallen, leaving him alone to carry the weight of her sacrifice? Exhaustion claimed him then, pulling him into a restless sleep filled with fragmented dreams. In them, he saw the Queen standing amidst the ruins of her throne room, her expression unreadable as she gazed upon the horizon. Behind her loomed the armored figures, their weapons raised, their voices chanting in unison. And in the distance, the crystal pulsed faintly, calling to him like a beacon in the void. When Elias awoke, the ship was eerily quiet. The alarms had ceased, and the vibrations that had shaken its core were gone. For a moment, he wondered if it had all been a dream, if the crystal, the Queen, the invaders, none of it had been real. But the ache in his body and the lingering warmth of the artifact pressed against his chest told him otherwise. Summoning the last reserves of his strength, Elias rose to his feet. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain: the journey was far from over. Elias moved cautiously through the now silent corridors of the alien ship, his footsteps echoing faintly against the cold metallic walls. The eerie stillness was unnerving, as if the vessel itself were holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone, to emerge from the shadows. His body ached with every step, but he pressed on, driven by an unrelenting need to understand what had happened after he fled the chamber. Had the Queen survived? What of the invaders? And most importantly, what had become of the catalyst? As he navigated deeper into the labyrinthine halls, subtle changes began to manifest around him. The glowing symbols etched into the walls flickered erratically, their usual rhythmic pulsations replaced by chaotic bursts of light. The air grew heavier, tinged with an electric charge that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. It was as though the ship's very essence was unraveling, destabilized by the activation of the ancient device. Then, without warning, the floor beneath him shuddered violently, nearly knocking him off balance. A deep, resonant hum reverberated through the structure, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. Elias froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Something was coming. Something immense and unstoppable. Before he could react, a blinding flash of light erupted at the end of the corridor, illuminating the passage like a miniature sun. Shielding his eyes, Elias squinted through the glare and saw a figure emerging from the brilliance. At first, he thought it was one of the armored invaders, but as the figure stepped closer, he realized with a mixture of relief and dread that it was her, the alien queen. She looked different now, altered somehow. Her once pristine scales bore scorch marks and scratches, evidence of the battle she must have endured. Her regal posture was slightly slumped, her movements weary yet determined. But her eyes, those multifaceted orbs that seemed capable of peering straight into his soul, burned with renewed intensity. She carried herself not as a conqueror or ruler, but as someone who had faced unimaginable loss and emerged transformed. "Human," she said, her voice soft yet commanding, translating effortlessly into his mind. "You live." Elias nodded, clutching the crystal tightly to his chest. I don't know how much longer any of us will," he admitted, gesturing toward the trembling walls around them. "What's happening?" The queen hesitated, her gaze drifting downward momentarily before meeting his again. "The catalyst has awakened the core of this vessel, an engine designed to bridge dimensions. Its activation threatens to tear apart the fabric of space-time itself." Her words sent a chill down his spine. "Can we stop it?" Her expression darkened. "Perhaps. But not alone. My sister," she paused, her voice faltering briefly, "and her followers are gone, consumed by their own ambition. Their attempt to seize control of the catalyst triggered a cascade reaction within the core. To stabilize it, we must return the catalyst to its rightful place." "And where is that?" Elias asked, though he already feared the answer. "The heart of the engine," she replied solemnly. "A place no living being can enter and survive." For a long moment, neither spoke. The weight of her statement hung heavy in the air between them. Elias knew what she was implying, that one of them would have to make the ultimate sacrifice. Yet even as fear clawed at his resolve, another emotion surfaced: determination. He had come too far, endured too much, to let despair win now. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I'll take the catalyst to the core." The queen stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she shook her head. "No. This burden falls to me. I am bound to this ship, to this legacy. It is my duty to see it undone." "But you've already sacrificed so much," Elias protested, stepping forward. "You saved me back there. You trusted me with the catalyst. Let me finish what we started together." Her gaze softened, and for the first time, he saw vulnerability in her eyes, not weakness, but acceptance. "You misunderstand, human. Trust is not given lightly among my kind. By entrusting you with the catalyst, I acknowledged your worth, not just as a survivor, but as someone who understands the cost of power. That is why I cannot allow you to perish here." Tears welled up in her eyes, shimmering like liquid starlight. "You carry echoes of my past, of those I failed to protect. Through you they live on. Do not dishonor their memory by throwing away your life." Elias opened his mouth to argue further, but the words caught in his throat. There was truth in her words, a truth he couldn't deny. Whatever bond they had formed transcended species and circumstance. It was built on shared pain, mutual respect, and an unspoken promise to fight for something greater than themselves. Finally, he nodded, lowering his gaze. "Then, let me help you get there. At least give me that." A small, bittersweet smile touched her lips. "Very well." Together, they moved swiftly through the collapsing ship, navigating corridors that groaned under the strain of impending destruction. The closer they drew to the core, the more unstable the environment became. Gravity fluctuated wildly, sending them stumbling against walls one moment and floating weightlessly the next. Energy discharges crackled in the air, leaving trails of ozone in their wake. Despite the chaos, the queen remained steadfast, guiding him with unwavering purpose. When they reached the threshold of the core chamber, Elias found himself standing before a colossal gateway, a swirling vortex of light and shadow that pulsed with raw, untamed energy. At its center floated a pedestal identical to the one he had discovered earlier, save for the fact that it radiated an almost unbearable heat. This was the heart of the engine, the nexus point where dimensions converged. The queen turned to face him, her expression resolute yet tender. "This is where our paths diverge, human. You have done more than I ever expected, and more than I deserved. For that, I am grateful." Elias swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. "Thank you," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. "For trusting me. For showing me that even queens bleed." Her smile widened, though tears streamed freely down her cheeks. "And thank you, Elias, for reminding me that scars can heal, but only when shared." With that, she stepped toward the vortex, raising the catalyst high above her head. As she approached the pedestal, the artifact began to glow brighter, resonating with the energy of the core. The queen placed it gently onto the surface, and instantly, the entire chamber erupted in a symphony of light and sound. Waves of energy surged outward, engulfing everything in their path. Elias shielded his face, bracing himself for the inevitable. But instead of destruction, he felt warmth, a soothing embrace that filled him with peace and clarity. When he lowered his arms, the vortex had stabilized, its chaotic swirls replaced by a serene, golden glow. The queen stood at its center, her form translucent, bathed in radiant light. "You must go now," she said, her voice echoing softly. "Take what remains of this ship and leave this place. Carry the lessons of this journey with you, and remember, even in darkness, there is always hope." Before he could respond, the ground beneath him trembled violently, propelling him backward. The walls of the chamber began to collapse, forcing him to retreat. As he ran, he glanced over his shoulder one last time, catching a final glimpse of the queen. She raised a hand in farewell, her smile serene and eternal. When Elias finally emerged from the wreckage of the alien ship, he found himself adrift in the vast expanse of space. Miraculously, a fragment of the vessel's escape pod remained intact, allowing him to chart a course back to Earth. As he drifted through the void, cradling the lingering warmth of the queen's sacrifice, he vowed to honor her memory, not just as a ruler, but as someone who had taught him the true meaning of courage, compassion, and redemption. And though the stars stretched endlessly before him, Elias knew one thing for certain: he was no longer alone.